if unattached burdens have been there a while, right? Unattached burdens can also be handed down as a legacy burden, right? They can show up there too, right? So they can shift in all kinds of ways. I've also seen it where if an unwell deceased that is an unwell ancestor is connected to the client system, and that may be the only connection to family, right, that the client may experience that feels somewhat okay, right? Then,
Yeah.
that's attachment work right there.
Hey everyone, I'm Tammy Sollenberger, the author of The One Inside 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about who they are, the different parts of themselves, and for those who want to connect with their true self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
I am super excited today to have Dr. Daphne Fatter on the podcast. This is actually your second time, if I'm right about that.
Yeah, that's right.
Daphne is a licensed psychologist, certified IFS therapist, and IFS clinical consultant. She's also a certified ancestral lineage healing practitioner using Dr. Daniel, is it Foyer?
It's four.
Four's
Yeah.
method for ancestral healing. Dr. Fatter guides groups, workshops, trainings for therapists on trauma, IFS, and ancestral healing worldwide. Her next IFS informed ancestral healing course will be offered online in November, which is super excited. So I don't know when people are listening to this, but that will be November of 2023. So I'm super excited to talk to Daphne. Daphne has written a chapter in the Altogether Us book on ancestral lineage healing. So welcome, Daphne.
Thank you so much, Tammy. It's great to be back. Yeah, great to be here.
Good. I'm excited. So we were just talking about this. This is the first time I just sort of dropped people's bios because I don't usually do that, but I decided, you know what, let me go ahead and read your bio. So why don't we start where we always start, which is where you are in the world and what you would see if you look out your nearest window.
Sure. So I'm actually facing my window with the front of my home right now. So I'm looking outside my window. I'm seeing a beautiful big old oak tree that's fully in bloom for summer. It has full green leaves on it. Keeps things nice and cool in my home office. And yes, and I am located in the unceded lands of the Comanche, Wichita, Kickapoo, and Caddo tribes. Here, which is present day Dallas, Texas. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for giving us that. And I'm guessing as you tell us that, I have a question about like if that like how that is related to ancestral lineage, as even as you say, like this is the ground that I'm on.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
might not be,
Yes,
but that's just what was popped in my head.
sure. It absolutely is connected because part of ancestral lineage healing is also acknowledging the reality of harms done collectively and systemically around the world, but particularly given my social location as a white-bodied person that holds lots of privilege, has lots of privileged identities. Definitely important for me to be aware of where I am and what has happened here on the land and how
Mm,
people that look like me, what has been done by the white body collective. So
mm.
absolutely, it's connected.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, good. Of course, me like, whew, good, because I was putting that together in my head and I wasn't sure. So
Yeah,
why don't we back up and how about we just start with what is ancestral lineage healing? Like, what are we talking about?
sure. So, want to fully honor and acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Daniel Four. This is his method. So I'm trained as well as many practitioners are trained in his method of ancestral lineage healing. It is a five-step process of connecting with a well ancestral guide on a given blood lineage of a client or if you're one of your blood lineages, and asking the guide to help heal the deceased on that lineage. And then once the deceased are healed, so the guide is doing all the interacting with the deceased on that given lineage, then that lineage is considered in a well state and is more about maintenance of that relationship and, honoring one's ancestors, doing ancestral reverence practices with whatever that, however that lands for the person, given their culture and given what the ancestral guide, how they would like to be honored. So it's really a um, embodied way of connecting with an ancestral guide and spirit, and asking them to help heal one's ancestors with anyone who is unwell, it's deceased.
Okay. And I love that your one thing I don't like about podcasts is they're not visual, because I can see you moving your hand, which really helped me understand more about what you were saying. So you're sort of moving your hand in and out as if there's sort of a line, right? There's a line between me and my ancestor, who is then healing all the people on this line and me.
Yes, right. So the healing, so one of the premises, there's a few different assumptions that this practice is based on. For one, this practice uh, is based on animism. So you don't have to be like a practicing animist to do this practice, but it is really, from the mindset that humans are part of a much larger web of relationships that have consciousness. Okay, so this includes our ancestors. So just want to name that. But this practice does have four assumptions. One of them is that there's consciousness after death. Okay. And one of them is that the deceased are not equally well and that the deceased can change, right? Similar to our parts internally, if we can think of ourselves, if we bring in sort of systems thinking from IFS, we can think of ourselves as being part of a much larger system that includes our ancestors. So the deceased are not all well, not all equally well in any one, given blood lineage. And that the deceased can change, very much like our parts can change. Um, the dead and the living can communicate. Okay, that's also one of the premises, is that we actually can connect with a well ancestral guide, um, and have an ongoing kind of emergent relationship with them, and that the living and the deceased can strongly affect one another. Okay. So by healing, doing the ancestral lineage healing practice, and that can actually help, as I talk about in the chapter, can help actually reorganize our internal system. Okay. If we're talking about legacy burdens, if we um, really include our ancestors and having that conscious embodied relationship with our ancestral guides, we're part of a much larger system, right, that includes our ancestors. After the lineage healing process happens, right, then the ancestral guide brings blessings to the living, including the client. And that ongoing relationship, I mean, it really can shift one system. It can really reorganize one system to include the ancestors. So relationally, it's a huge shift. It really helps. What I've noticed is one of the many things that I, in my own practice of it, but also in guiding clients in it and integrating IFS with it, is that it really helps a system sort of move out of always having to be self-reliant, right, on oneself, which is very common in our Western culture, particularly here in the United States, where individualism is highly valued. And so this really shifts in terms of, wow, we're actually part of a community with our ancestors, right? It's much more of a communal acknowledgement that it's not just all about us as individuals, but we actually are descendants of our ancestors, and really exploring what that means. So that's the practice. It's really profound. I know for me personally, it's changed my life. And I've seen just profound things in terms of particularly integrating it with IFS.
All right, these are going to be like my really dumb questions. Why do I want to connect to my ancestors? Like, because I'm thinking, I like the idea of like self. I'm all about self. Like, is self enough? And I also like the idea of spirit guides, right? Some sort of divine spirit guides. I'm like, okay, I've kind of bought that. I'm like, okay, I'm online with that. That feels pretty good to me. Like, and I wonder if people think about like their families or sort of the families, kind of what they know about their family. I'm like, I think I'm going to stick with self and my spirit guides. And yeah, so that's what's coming up for me. So tell me, I have parts that are easily influenced. So
I
Yeah, so
appreciate
tell
those
me.
parts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate those questions. That's great. Yeah, so there's so many different reasons to do ancestral healing, right? Ancestral lineage healing. Oftentimes, particularly if clients are doing IFS, that whole question of is self enough? I love IFS, right? IFS is fabulous, super healing, transformative model. Um, and this is, to me, this is like IFS plus, right? This is like, um, it can, when you get to know parts, right, people's parts really well, when clients explore their parts, we can really consider sort of the multidimensionality of parts. And at some point, legacy burdens will show up, or collective or cultural burdens will show up at some point. Um, and that is a time where ancestral lineage healing can be very life-changing, right? If clients are exploring really personal, sacred explorations around belonging, who am I? Why am I the way I am? Where do I belong? Um, exploring heirlooms or ancestral gifts. Oftentimes also unresolved grief. Say if clients have family member who passed away unexpectedly or traumatically, or they are in a family system where they have cut off relationship with living family, or or they're adopted and they're curious about, okay, I have no information about my family, my blood lineage, but I want to explore this. Ancestral healing, lineage healing, this particular practice can be so helpful, right? That connection with the guides. So you mentioned liking spirit guides. Ancestral guides are very similar to spirit guides, right? In terms of they can serve in a similar function as a spirit guide. However, ancestral guides, we are down lineage from them, right? So they are, they are my mentor, right? I'm accountable to them. It's a little bit of a shift of relationship compared to maybe like a spirit guide relationship. This is an ongoing relationship, and it's very much, can look at accountability. It's an invitation to look at loving accountability. What does it mean that I'm a descendant of my ancestors, right? What does that mean? What is my responsibility around that? How do I embody gifts around that, with ancestral gifts? And then on a very collective level, I mean, this is a communal practice. We are part of a larger system with our ancestors, and it can be a way, to, around collective healing and cultural repair as well. And really with the accountability piece, particularly, and I'm speaking, with my own social location, particularly being a white-bodied person, right, with Northern European ancestry. So, and some colonizer ancestry as well. So,
That is making sense to me. And I'm noticing, as I said, like I'm easily convinced. I'm noticing that like actually, I have these skeptical parts. And so I feel like I'm like so curious about this topic and noticing like the skeptical parts of me that are like, okay, well, you've kind of, have been convinced and then experienced the spirit guide thing. Like, cause I was like, that's baloney. And then had this experience during an IFS training about spirit guides. And I'm like, okay, so there's sort of these parts that are like, that's baloney, but then sort of this experience that's like, okay, I'm open. And so I have sort of both of these parts that are like, skeptical parts, and then parts that are like, we can be pretty open to stuff. So I'm sort of just noticing those two, as you're explaining. And I'm also noticing just so much curiosity, which I told you before. I was like, I'm so excited to talk about this because I know nothing and I'm so curious. But just acknowledging that skeptical parts and then the parts that are like, well, you get convinced of stuff really easily. So I'm just sort of going to speak for that.
well, and I will say, and I so appreciate you sharing your parts that you're noticing. It's very common, for people to have skeptical parts with this practice if they don't have any framework for what this looks like or what this is. Oftentimes, if a person has been raised in a particular faith community or practices a particular religion or spirituality, it can raise fear parts too of like, wait a minute, is it okay to do this? What does this mean that I'm doing this? And so I also want to mention we always get consent of the system. to do this practice. So we check inside and, with the IFS integration, we can check inside, ask for parts that have fears or concerns. And we can also invite in, we also get consent from, say, if a person already has relationship with, for example, a spirit guide or a guardian angel or, particular spiritual deity, for example, we include that in the practice. Okay, so we do this with lots of consent from the person's system so that it can be very client-centered. So I do want to mention that as well.
Love that. So how do you know? Let's say you're sort of doing, let's say, are you doing this in like a regular IFS session? And then how do you know when to introduce this or who to introduce this to, or like how do you do that? Yeah.
Sure. So, in clients that I do IFS with, if there's a certain point where it's either a legacy burden in particular, or where sometimes going back to that question of is self enough? I have worked with, I do my practice is all trauma, 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 typically. Historically, it's been that. And so sometimes there will be parts in this system that just have a really hard time receiving and trusting self. That restoring trust in self is just not happening for whatever reason. And after many, many attempts, right, that there's self energy there, but the part is like, like not budging, right? The exile in particular, or protective part. That would be the time to bring in, right? For one, we can ask that part, what blood lineage are you connected to, right?
Oh,
To
okay.
see, okay, the connection between our parts and our blood lineages, right? So we can get curious about that. That's the part that. Then we can also say, you know what, this is I want to tell you about another practice that's an option we can integrate. And I explain the practice. And when the client connects, particularly if that exile says, hey, I'm connected to my mother's lineage, okay, great. Well, let's connect with an ancestral guide from mother's lineage. That attachment repair can happen between the ancestral guide and the part directly, with self being there too. Okay. And that can really shift the system. So that's a place that I've seen that happen, right? Where that it's been very transformational, where that whole question of is self enough? Yes, self is enough. For most parts, it is enough. And yet, for some parts, they may carry such deep attachment wounds, particularly related to family of origin, that actually connecting to an ancestral guide is something that they can receive much more easily than self sometimes.
Beautiful. I love that. Okay. So, and would you, because they'll say, right, I don't want self, right? Sometimes I'll hear that, right? I don't want self.
Mhm.
I want mom, or I want like self is like
Mhm.
sort of like I don't want you, or and they might just say I don't want you, right? That's not enough. And so what if is that makes so much sense to me, because then I'm getting the idea that like the individual attachment, even right, sort of individual attachment with like self, that feels good, but also sort of the attachment to a larger community, like you're saying, like a larger kind of the attachment and the belonging, connectedness that you could feel with ancestors would feel very different than sort of there's self, there's God or divine, and it's just us and we hang out, like, and that feels good, but sort of this
Mhm.
has a different feeling, more of a connected, something feels different, deeper is the words coming up for me.
Yeah, it is a different felt sense experience for that part to connect with an ancestral guide. And oftentimes there's just healing happening even in that connection. If we can ask the ancestral guide directly to connect with the exile, their protector part, that has a hard time taking self in, then that part will soften because it's a different type of energy, right? The ancestral guide brings a different type of energy, brings all the wisdom from the ancestral lineage, and can also help the part understand where that belief and burden came from, or where that fear came from, or that protective strategy came from. yes, when we think about multidimensionality of parts, yes, there may be a personal this lifetime experience of that too, and story and narrative that's very important to witness. And yet there likely is a larger explanation, right? If we really consider the ancestral lineage as a whole, we all are carrying intergenerational and ancestral trauma. That is, I mean, there's no way that any of us are unscathed from that. And so the ancestral guide can really bring a almost a big update. If we think about it using IFS terms, it can bring a big update to this whole system and share, yeah, let me tell you more information, right? So we can think of the ancestral guide as really holding a memory network that we may not have access to with just in our internal system, right? It really is about that connection relationally with the guide, wanting to receive that information and getting that update from the guide that also can help contribute to that internal reorganization of the system and help soften, our parts to receive self energy ultimately.
I have two questions. One is, does someone need to know, and I've thought about this with legacy burdens, does someone need to know their family lineage? Do I need to know the story of my family? Okay, so tell me how that works. If I don't know, so you just shook your head no. So if I
Yeah.
don't know, like I know a little bit about both sides of my family, but not very much. So if this was me, if I was the client and I was, working with this part that either didn't want me, didn't want a connection with me, or I was like, I have this feeling of loneliness that doesn't make sense, or sort of I'm not sure why I have this, or it makes sense for a little bit, but I have it at this intense level that just sort of doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
And so we'd be sort of talking about maybe there's a legacy burden or something here, but I don't know really much about my family. How do you
Mhm.
handle that?
Yeah, you don't have to know anything about your family at all to do this practice, which I think is makes it very accessible for one, because there's many people around the world that, for many different reasons, do not know family history. And so, yeah, it makes it very accessible because of that. We're really getting information from the guide. In some ways, you know, it can help us. Oftentimes, what I find is in this work, a lot of the story that we have around legacy burdens is around the recent generations. If we do have family that we're connected with, our blood related family, this is from parents, from aunts, uncles. This is from grandparents. That generation, perhaps we may have our parts may hold the legacy burden, and that's sort of as far as it may go in terms of the narrative, right? Guide brings in the other pieces, right? The guide brings in information that parts can just feel, and it's like there's a resonance almost like in our bones when we hear it from the guide, that it's like, yeah, there's truth there. Um, that it's beyond words, sort of when the guide shares, okay, let's talk about, let me share this. This is a piece that happened. There was, famine, there was this, there was that, whatever it may be, all the contributing factors to that legacy burden. The guide will bring that, and the part will feel mirrored because it's like putting words to what the part is holding energetically that it may not understand. And even if it does know the family narrative from the more recent generations, it may not make total sense, right, to the part or self.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So then I'm going to hold off on my other question. So then is there, um, can you walk through the protocol then of like, okay, so there's, I'm saying this, right? I'm saying that like there's this loneliness or the sense of belonging, or, I don't know where this is coming from. I don't know what's going on, or I have this part that's like not interested in me. And so what would you do, or sort of how would you lead me into connecting with this ancestral guide?
Sure. So I want to mention Daniel Forbes' book for the specific method, just as a source resource, and I'll share that in the show notes with you, um, just for the specific kind of language around it. But I do mention the steps as well in the chapter. So basically, it would be okay, Tammy, let's, ideally, in an ideal world, if we're doing the 5 steps, we would do what's called an assessment first. Okay. So for people that come to me to come to any ancestral lineage healing practitioner in this method, do what's called an assessment first, where you're basically looking through 4 different windows, if you will, to really see the wellness of each of your lineages. And at what point on the lineage are potentially ancestors not well? So, for example, we break it down into very linear time. So, in terms of like older, super duper old ancestors, so 2000 years and older, right? To 2000 years to 500 years is more the middle ones, and then the past 500 years, so the more recent generations. Um, so really helping the client even get a sense of, okay, what lineage has the most wellness on it overall, particularly among the ancient ones. Um, Usually, um, not always, but ancestral guides typically come from more of the ancient ones, where ancestral reverence practices were more likely to still be intact before, say, colonization, for example. And so we say, okay, we have agreement and consent with the client system about which lineage we're focusing on, say if it's connected to a legacy burden we're working on. And then we say, okay, turn towards that lineage and from your heart, yeah, you know, from your heart, extend your awareness as far back as time as needed, skipping over any trouble points in lineage and asking time and space where ancestors are well in spirit and connected to each other. Ask an ancestral guide to step forward, making their presence known to you. We then, as a practitioner, we also make sure that the guide is the guide, right? So there's specific questions we do to assess that. And these are, written in the chapter as well, but these are, okay, are you an ancestor on this lineage? Yes or no? There are other spirits, there are other deceased that might pop up that may not be connected to this lineage, right? So we want to make sure. So we ask that. Another question we ask is, are they willing and able to be a guide? Sometimes ancestors are fabulous and they show up in people's systems or their dreams or plant medicine journeys for various reasons. They may be the guide, they may be a full ancestor, but they may not have the role of the guide in the system. So we ask, are you able and willing to serve as a guide for any repair needed on this lineage? And then are you well and connected with all the elders that came before you on the lineage? Again, so we're just confirming. And then we have the client check in their own internal system. And this is wonderful for IFS integration. How does the person, the client system feel? Do their parts feel safe and good in this guide's presence? If it's the ancestral guide, it is going to feel like, wow, I feel really met right now. I feel really seen. I'm definitely in the presence of an elder. And there's an energetic quality, felt sense quality to that. That's, we only go with a full bodied yes from the client system before we really have the client then breathe the guide, right? So that's what we would do. We would then, in terms of legacy unburdening, and I mentioned this protocol in the chapter, we ask the guide, you know, um, tell us about the burdens on this lineage and what are the ancestral gifts? We can ask the guide, were there specific contributing factors, external factors, or what was happening at the time that, contributes to this. Oftentimes, sometimes legacy burdens will come up as attachment wounds. It's like, okay, what happened that contributed to that? And we really, part that's holding the legacy burden is also present, right? So the guide is connecting to the exile, self is present as well. So there's this, the exile is receiving self presence as well as the ancestral guide's presence. And with that energetic update and the information, typically, very often it'll be, can happen spontaneously in terms of a legacy unburdening. But then we can ask, how does the exile want to release that? Oftentimes, the exile will give it to the ancestral guide. Okay. This is different than sending the burdens back, which is, I know, a very helpful also practice in IFS. So that's a lovely practice as well. This is different than that. This is really giving um, the burden to the ancestral guide. And then the guide, if there are deceased that are affected by that say more recent generations that may still somehow be connected to that legacy burden, the guide can bring healing to those, okay, rather than the client having any direct contact with the deceased. So the client only has direct contact with the ancestral guide, not the deceased. And so that's important, right? That's a very important thing. The guide is the mediator to work with the deceased, not um, so that's essentially the practice. Sometimes there's a layer of healing that needs to happen among the deceased before all the parts connected to that legacy burden can unburden. Sometimes that doesn't need to happen, so it just depends. We really follow, the sequence of whatever needs to happen in the client's system. And we trust the leadership of the guide. That's another piece with IFS. Bringing an ancestral guide, they are like collective self energy. And so when in the presence of an ancestral guide, we really trust their leadership in terms of how the healing needs to proceed.
Okay, so that's all fascinating and answered my other question was about, because you talked about the well and unwell of the different deceased. And I wondered if the ancestral guide had to be well or unwell, like it had to have a certain, was it also well or unwell, or did it have to have a certain level of wellness? But it sounds like, yes, it does. Like it has to be a
Yes.
well deceased ancestor.
Yes, the ancestral guide is a well-deceased ancestor, right?
Okay.
And again, this comes from the really the worldview that not all deceased are equally well in spirit for various reasons beyond my understanding, right? They're not all equally well in spirit, and this process can help them become well. Um, so yes, but the guide is a well ancestor.
I love that. Okay. And then I also just want to mention, there's a part of me that says, I think we should tell people just in case they don't know what a legacy burden is. Maybe we could just sort of, they might be listening. It's already half over, more than half over. And they're like, I don't even know what you guys are talking about. Can we just tell them what a legacy burden is and sort of this idea of passing it back or, yeah, now I'm realizing, gosh, sometimes I do this very quick. I'm like, let's just have all of your ancestors come around the circle and da, 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 like into this 30-second thing. And I'm like, wow, that's not really honoring the lineage when I do it that quickly. And with this sort of like, just have everybody come in and sort of throw the burden on the fire. And there we go, all is well. So let's talk a little bit about what a legacy burden is.
Sure. Yes. Great. So legacy burden. So parts can carry, and this, is completely from Dick Schwartz, right? So this is parts can carry personal burdens more from this lifetime experience. And then they can carry legacy burdens. And legacy burdens can encompass a lot of things. They can encompass burdens handed down intergenerationally from our ancestors, from our family systems, from the dominant collective culture that we live in. What in response to dominant culture, legacy burdens, cultural burdens as well, depending on, based on our social location, our own identities, in response to current day collective dominant culture, as well as systemic repression, and also this historical person as well. Right, and historical trauma. So legacy burdens can encompass all of that. It's sort of an umbrella term that encompasses all of that. I think a lot of times in IFS, a lot of times with clients, it shows up as intergenerational trauma. It can show up as lots of different things.
Yeah.
Would you add anything to that, Tammy, since you're also an IFS therapist?
Well, the thing that I was thinking as you're talking about that is that I remember some training where they said we all have them, and so I think that's the thing that's so important is we do all have these legacy burdens, whether it is just the culture that we live in or we grew up in. But yeah, I mean, how could we not have the legacy burdens of our family of origin and then their parents and their parents and their parents. And we can see it in like, I mean, I think the thing that I would add is we see it in really simple things we do, sort of whether it's sort of how we cook the things, how we do Thanksgiving or how we do a holiday or how we do manners or sort of family rules. I mean, it can show up in something super simple like that it's sort of like, this is just what we do because it's why we do it. And it feels really normal and natural, but actually, no, there's sort of, it's based on generational stuff that's why we do the thing the way we do the thing. And so if that is something as so
Right.
simple as that, then why wouldn't there be bigger things about the way we think about ourselves and treat other people and the way we love and the way we connect? And so I think it does make a lot of sense that it, and I think too that it's so important, this idea of there's stuff that's happening in our current life. As sort of I can look at my life and I can be like, yeah, I have parts that are burdened around these things that, from, you know, from birth, which I think it's not just from birth, but let's just say birth until this moment right now. But doesn't it make it just, it's not just that. And I think we can feel that when we're sort of like, okay, here's the part and here's the part's belief. But I think I said this earlier, but the intensity of that belief doesn't necessarily match what I know or what kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah, totally. And usually, and I love that you said that because that's been my experience too, and for my own system, but also a client's, where typically legacy burdens in part show up as like, this is the way it's always been. And oftentimes it can also show up in the body. It's somatic memory. I mean, just so deeply embedded that it's like, oh gosh, breaking that role would mean death or breaking, I mean, it's just such, it can be a very strong response for parts to even, explore it that, oh, well, this is the way it's always been, this is how we do things, or, all of those kind of things can come up with legacy burdens.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that sort of like even noticing kind of what feels incongruent. Like this is how it's always been, but something just doesn't, something feels off about that. Or there's something that feels sort of not congruent here. I love it. Is there anything else you want to say about the protocol?
I don't think so. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that that kind of sums it up. I mean, it's really around trusting the guidance of the guide. Oftentimes when I've like groups around this, it's lots of questions will come up around, well, what about this? Or my part is responding this way. It's like, great, let's bring that to the guide. It's really about that relationship with the guide. So it's really trusting the guide's leadership, bringing the guide into the relational system.
Tell us about how to discern whether a client has an unattached burden, which we probably will have to explain what that is. How do we decide whether a client has an unattached burden or an unwell deceased attached to a part? So first tell us what an unattached burden is.
Sure. Yes. So unattached burden is just, we can think of it as unwell energy, right? That doesn't have a body. It's in the unseen world, meaning that most people can't visually see it. Some people can, but most people can't. Um, and unattached burdens are very normal. I want to kind of demystify them in terms of really normalizing them. They're just like catching a cold. Like at some point, somebody will have an unattached burden. We all do. I've had them. I would imagine you've had them. Like it's very normal to have an unattached burden at some point, get into the system and attach to the part. It's just unwell energy that typically can show up trying to do harm in some way, shape, or form. So that's an unattached burden, right? It's not a part. They can attach to our parts. Um, Unwell deceased. So spirits of all kinds, including unwell deceased, can blend with our parts and also attach to our parts. And so, sort of, if we take a wide umbrella of the unseen world, when we think about unattached burdens or unwell deceased or spirits or guides, all the things. But when we think about um, unwell deceased, it's really important to ask. So, using the kind of IFS protocol around unattached burdens. And I want to give, Bob Falconer, acknowledge his contribution to this conversation, as well as obviously Dick Schwartz. So we ask that, when we ask, are you a part, right? If you're sensing like, wait, this doesn't seem to be shifting in my IFS session. I'm doing all the IFS, I'm doing the 6Fs, it's not changing. Are you a part? And if it says no, instead of automatically assuming like, oh, okay, we've got an unattached burden on our hands, to ask some additional questions. And the questions that I suggest is asking, okay, is this energy connected to a blood lineage? Right? That's helping us decipher, okay, is it somehow connected to the ancestral realm from our blood ancestors? If it says yes, then we have the client ask which blood lineage is it connected to, right? So that helps us know, okay, right there, you know, where this energy or this being is connected to, okay? If it says no, we can say, is it connected to any unwell deceased? Okay, so we're still exploring. We're still not yet assuming, okay, it's an unattached burden. Let's still explore. If it's like, no, I'm not connected to a lineage, um, but I'm not a part. All right. Um, let's find out. Are you connected to any unwell deceased? This can include a wide variety of beings. Okay. This can include non-blood deceased, people that are in, loved ones that aren't necessarily blood relatives, that are deceased, lost spirits, connected to ancestors of place and land. So there can be a lot of beings attached to our parts, right? In addition to unattached burdens. If it says no to all those things, I'm still not a part, then we can say, all right, now we're working with an unattached burden. And the way that I work with any of those scenarios, whether it be unattached burden, unwell deceased, whether it be blood unwell deceased or otherwise, is I take a real communal approach. And so I have the client connect with what we call protective guide, um, which is, again, following kind of using Daniel Ford's method here. So I have the client connect with a protective guide. This is different than the ancestral guide. If they already have a connection with the ancestral guide and it's an unwell deceased on a lineage, blood lineage, then great. Let's bring in the ancestral guide, and that ancestral guide will help usher that being along wherever they need to go for healing. But if it's not, if we don't have connection with an ancestral guide already, we then invite the client to connect with a protective guide. A protective guide is like a spirit guide. It's a guide in the unseen world. Okay, so it doesn't have a body that the client can connect with. If the client already has connection with a spiritual being or higher power or any sort of, divine being at all, according to their own worldview or spirituality, then we invite that in. Okay. So having the client connect with the protective guide and just asking the guide for support. And so asking the guide to help release either whether it be an unattached burden or unwell deceased from the system. This, from my view, is very respectful, for one, of the being that's there, because it's really bringing in it. The word that comes up for me is etiquette. It's really etiquette. You're bringing in a resource from the unseen world. Unattached burdens live in the unseen world. I mean, they are part of the unseen world. So it's bringing sort of a being that knows their moves. So shall we say? Um,
Yeah.
so that's my approach to it. It is also important to ask, not only, of course, befriending parts through IFS that have fears or concerns about the being, say if it's an unattached burden or unwell deceased. So we want to befriend those parts that have fear, right, about the unattached burden or the unwell deceased. But what I've found is sometimes those parts are so connected to the body, particularly if it's a pretty strong unattached burden that doesn't want to leave. Oftentimes the parts will be very closely blended with our body. So for example, oh gosh, the hair on my neck is standing up because I can sense that this unattached burden wants to do harm. It's like, okay, again, we call in the protective guide, have the client receive self energy from the protective guide if they can't unblend, right, with their parts that are scared of it. So that's another piece that I do. Another important thing to say is even for unattached burdens as well as unwell deceased, particularly if they're ancestors, right, if they're unwell ancestors in spirit, is to ask, are there any parts that have fears or concerns around letting it go? About releasing it, because oftentimes if they've been there a while, our system organizes around it, right? And that's our homeostasis. That's all the system knows. And so we want to also befriend those parts as well. And we might need to do IFS, classic IFS unburdening with those parts first, and connection. Again, bringing in protective guide is another additional source of self energy as well during the process. So that's my approach to working with it, just asking some additional questions and really honoring that a lot of things from the unseen world can connect with parts in our system, including unattached burdens.
That's great. And then do you, I love that. I love that. I love that you ask like an entity, kind of like a protective guide or a spirit guide kind of from that world to come in, because it's sort of like, okay, you guys are speaking the same language a little bit. I love that. And then I agree with the working with the parts that, and this is true for all of our parts, right? We have parts that like it and parts that don't like it, parts that are really aligned with it and need it, and parts that are afraid of it. So that makes so much sense that would happen with this too. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And then then you ask it to leave, or you ask it to go back into the light? Like, is that kind of what you do?
Yes. So we actually have the protective guide do that. So that's also a difference in approach, sort of with the traditional IFS way of working with it, is that in my experience, by asking the protective guide to help release it, really the self moves into receptive, the whole system moves into receptivity for receiving help. So the client is not put in, their parts are not put in any position to do it themselves. Because it can be tricky sometimes particularly with the really ones that have been there a while that don't want to leave. They might put up a good fight. So this is a way to help the client move out of self-reliance, right? Of having to do it all themselves and asking for support from the protective guide. And so the protective guide is the one that actually fully releases the unattached burden or helps usher the unwell deceased to wherever they need to go for healing. If it's an unwell deceased that's part of one's blood ancestors, right? That's going to be maybe a difference of where they go. Highly likely we're going to go to a specific place for healing. For unattached burdens, yeah, the protective guide can take them to the light or in another dimension, another realm that they can go to receive healing.
I love
Yes, so
that.
that's been my experience with it. And I found typically the one thing that I will say that's another piece that's super helpful about encouraging people to have relationship with a protective guide in the unseen world. I've seen it be almost like taking like an immune support supplement or something, right? It can help with energetic hygiene in one system. It can help with, okay, now I know how to handle this. I have relational support to navigate this a little bit, and I have a little bit more protection to maybe decrease the risk of, something coming to my system super easily. And we get curious about the parts that can take them on. I know for me as a highly sensitive person, right? I historically, earlier in my life is like, "Whoop, I just absorb everything, right? Everybody's feelings. Right. That's right. Most therapists
That
have
makes
parts like
sense. Yes.
right. And
Yeah.
so having that relationship with the protective guide for sort of energetic boundaries can be so helpful also.
I love that. And that makes so much sense, right? If we absorb people's feelings and absorb all the energy around us, why we wouldn't absorb other things and other entities and other
Mhm.
things. I think that makes sense. The other thing that you said that I loved was you say the unwell deceased or the unattached burden, they go to a place for healing, right? It's not like, get out of here, you don't belong here, go. It's like, it's this more gentle, go into the light or go to a healing place for healing.
Mhm.
And I had
Yes.
not thought of that or heard it that way before. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, that's great. Person system the client has to have full consent of their parts for that release to happen. I will say I have seen it be where if unattached burdens have been there a while, right? Unattached burdens can also be handed down as a legacy burden, right? They can show up there too, right? So they can shift in all kinds of ways. And so the client system has to give full consent. I've also seen it where if an unwell deceased that is an unwell ancestor is connected to the client system, and that may be the only connection to family, right, that the client may experience that feels somewhat okay, right? Then,
Yeah.
that's attachment work right there that
Yeah.
might need to happen first before that unwell deceased is willing to move on for healing and that part can receive support from self and the protective guide.
I love that. I think
So,
that's such an important point, and that there is this, if anger, like sort of as you're talking, I'm thinking of sort of my dad's side of the family as sort of this anger legacy burden, that I am sort of just noticing sort of this funny, it's not a funny story, actually, it's an awful story, but sort of this funny story that's everyone tells about my great grandfather. So I was thinking about how that that actually can become a joining, right? Like when I go home and I get around my dad, there's sort of a certain way of joining that family that feels like this is how I'm connected to that family, is we talk like this and we do whatever. And it's sort of like, kind of feels icky, but it's also the way I join with them and connect to them. So yeah, I
mhm.
love that you said that it's like parts that might really feel like, but it's the only way of connecting. It's the only way of connecting to my family or connecting to um, somebody that loves me or something. Yeah. So I think that was a really good point. And then noticing the parts around that, right? And it's sort of, that's right, like
Mhm.
kind of backing up and then noticing those parts. I have one more question though. So you said, okay, so can the ancestral guide only help the parts connected to that lineage, or can the ancestor guide help everybody in the system?
The ancestral guide can help realistically most parts in the system, if not all. But I will say that the parts directly connected. I mean, it's unusual for a part to be like only connected to one lineage, right? I mean, we are so complex genetic beings that we are a mix of our blood ancestors all around. So um but sometimes there will be a legacy burden that's very clearly from one lineage. And if that's the case, that guide from that particular blood lineage would be the best fit for healing, particularly around attachment repair that may need to happen. But in general, ancestral guides can serve as a guide for all of our parts. I mean, they really can. They really can be a source of collective self energy.
I love that because it's like more people on your team, right? Like it's sort of like,
Hmm.
it's like the divine. Well, for me, it would be like the divine and my spirit guide, and obviously self, like my authentic self. But I was like, yeah, like why wouldn't my system, well, I can see there's parts that are not open to that, but I could see just sort of like intellectually that, like, yeah, why wouldn't parts want to have more people on my team supporting me?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that whole going back to the whole question that you asked earlier around is self enough? Yes, self is enough for most parts. And yet, having the ancestral guide bears an additional relational resource can be really transformational for client systems, particularly there's been attachment trauma on some level in a lineage at any point, and exiles may have a really hard time attaching to self or trusting self. It really shifts when we bring in the ancestral guide.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm also really noticing, and I don't think I really was aware of this until you and I were talking about sort of the part that is like, well, I can do it myself. So I think I have this little, 2-year-old that's like, well, I can do it myself, because I'm really noticing that. I'm really noticing that as we talk, is
Mhm.
sort of like part that's like, well, no, I can do it myself. Like, oh, okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, yeah, so I'm just noticing that. So I just really invite
Yeah.
people that have listened this far. I'm so glad you have. And I want you just to notice your skeptical parts, notice the parts that are coming up for you as you listen to this. But how open are you to this information for yourself and for your clients? So let's do our last question. Let me stop. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, thank you so much. Yeah. I will say this also, this practice is a huge, I guess the last thing I'll say is this practice is a huge shift in, I think that individuality, identity. I mean, it just, or like, way that I relate to my parts now. I mean, it even shifts how I relate to my parts. Like I'm very aware with a lot of humility that I am down lineage from thousands and thousands of ancestors. So it's also a practice around it can really shift relationships as well as just how we relate to our parts. It's a lot more self-compassion. I mean, I feel like it can bring in a lot more self-compassion and humility around, of course, this part has this burden, or this part knows how to protect my system in this way. So I will just share that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I think that's what I'm really feeling. Kind of this part of me is like, I'm having some aha moments as we talk. So I appreciate that. So if you weren't doing all the things that you do and you're a mom of triplets, I feel like if people didn't remember that you're a mom of triplets, what would you be doing instead? And you had to
Oh
do
my
something
gosh.
different.
Yeah, if I had to do something different, it would definitely involve probably travel and writing and probably eating. So I would say maybe like a travel writer and food critic. I could probably
Perfect. You're like all
but I
those
would
things
want to
could
take
fit
my
together.
kids. Yeah, I would want to take my kids. So traveling with them, getting their worldview like through their eyes. I would love that experience to share that with them. And then being some sort of like travel food critic blogger or something like that sounds like a lot of fun.
That sounds super fun. So I hope you do that. And then like we could meet up. You could be like, oh, I'm in this fun place. And then we can meet up with Jenna.
That'd be great. Yay, that'd be fun. We need to go to a beach.
Yes. I'm in.
Okay, great. Me too.
All right, Daphne, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, like, all the things. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or all the places books are available. You can also visit my website, tammysalenberger.com, where you can download a free meditation on getting to know your should parts. You know, there's parts of you who remind you of what you should be doing. They sound a bit critical at times. Yes, we all have them. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and Twitter and the One Inside Facebook page. I'm so grateful for Jack Reardon, who created the new music. Jack is a graduate of Derek Scott's IFS Stepping Stone program. Thanks, Jack, for getting me. And to you, thanks for listening.